Gawker before, but actually much of his work has been about complex systems and the role of narratives in transmitting knowledge, in creating knowledge. And he turned that wonderful Welsh word, Cynefin, which is often translated as environment, but it's something much deeper. It's more akin to the Japanese ba. You know, it's got a bit of philosophical depth to it, into a term that is used by management consultants, probably mangling the pronunciation, and I hope you get commissioned around the world. Very glad that you could join us.
I'm not sure about the Cynefin stuff. I actually got phoned up by the Welsh Language Society, and they said, we're in Washington, and we've seen a Welsh word on a notice board. Are you responsible? The tone of it had me slightly worried. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here as somebody who drives a 160-mile round trip to see the Blues getting humiliated. At least there's some compensation if you know to claim the expense of the bridge for taxpayers today. It's also rather weird to be in the building where my Aunt Mary used to dish out plastic. Just to give a background on this, about 10 years ago I left IBM. Before that I was in IBM, before that I was in another company. But we were working on narrative and complexity theory, basically and micro-narratives and self-interpreted narratives. That came to the attention of the US government, and we ended up working for data on counter-terrorism before and after 9/11. And after 9/11, we were the only non-American team, and we were all Welsh. So I'm not sure whether I should be proud of that or not. But, and we were the only ones who were actually saying you can't do everything with big data. You actually need human beings to do primary interpretation, and human beings to do secondary interpretation. And you can't take a linear deterministic point of view. You've got to understand what are the evolutionary potential of the present. If I'm honest about it, and we're doing work at the moment on the peace negotiations between FARC and the Colombian government. And the only way you can achieve that sort of reconciliation is to change the narrative of the past so a new narrative can emerge from that. I'll talk about this in scaling in a minute. If I go back at the age of 14, we have a long tradition in my family of the eldest child is in a police cell with civil disobedience before they're 18. My daughter let the side down badly. She's the first and sixth generation. I managed it at 14 in Derry. My mother thought I was on a young socialist youth camp somewhere in Wales, and we were on the Civil Rights March. Now, if I'm honest about it, most of us who were involved in that at that time were on the verge of joining the RA for about a 4 or 5 year period. And actually, the story of reconciliation in Northern Ireland isn't we were right and you were wrong. It's there that the grace of God went by. So that ability to redefine the narrative of the past to enable the narrative of the future is key. The second thing which also comes with that, and we do work on what's called distributed ethnography, because the danger with pure ethnography is you're too subject to expert bias and expert interpretation of the material. But we've been doing work with the UN at the moment, for example, with Roma in Eastern Europe and with kids in Africa who've been subject to genital mutilation and rape. Those people are now acting as field ethnographers into their own communities, capturing narrative, enabling those people to self-interpret those narratives. That allows us to scale ethnography over huge populations very, very quickly. Now, what's been fascinating, what you often find, that stories that experts think are negative actually turn out to be positive when you allow people to have the power to interpret their own story. And at the moment, although we say people's story their own, we actually take power to ourselves as experts, rather than allowing them the power to do that interpretation. That was a big innovation we did in the way we move forward. Now, for the UN, we've now taken clusters of stories and interpreted the same way in Africa and in Roma. And the Roma problem in Eastern Europe is huge. Nobody's got into those communities before. We then represented the stories to experts in Washington and Vienna and asked them to interpret those stories the way they think they were interpreted in the field. And they interpret them with high correlation. There's just no correlation between the two groups. What you actually see in the expert interpretation is an instrumentalist approach. We know what is good for these people. Therefore, we will interpret these stories based on what we already wanted to do. Whereas the people themselves describe their problems in the context of day-to-day living. Right? Now that's a big and massive switch. Right? Because one of the things we say, and this is coming from a complexity point of view, a complex adaptive system, and I won't go into full theory on this, is not causal, it's dispositional. Now, that's actually really scary for governments, because it means there isn't any repetition. You can't say, if I do this, can't say, if I pull this lever, it will produce that effect. You can't say, this thing worked in clinician, it will work in swamping. Yeah? Because actually, in a complex adaptive system, the number of variables is such that the same thing only ever happens again the same way twice by accident. So all the work done on setting specific goals is actually counterproductive. And if you don't know the research data on this, and this is without any contradiction anywhere in the world, I'm talking about real science now. Sorry, I'm a philosopher, physicist. We have a prejudice against sociologists, sorry. From both disciplines, to be clear on it. Is whenever people are working for explicit, tangible rewards, it destroys intrinsic motivation. I'll repeat that because it's key. When people are working for intrinsic, tangible goals, it destroys intrinsic motivation. Which translates into teachers who fill out learning plans getting rewarded, whereas teachers who inspire kids to learn get punished. And I could go on to many other examples. Right? And that's been one of the motivations behind what we've been doing for years, because we can now set people targets based on changing the stories that people tell. You basically say at the moment you've got 30% of your stories in this rough area. Over the next year you've got to get 50% from there, yeah, which is ungainable. The only way you can change that is to change the stories that people tell. But you've also got a feedback loop into the system, so you can say, how would we get people to tell more stories like this and fewer stories like those? Which means you can engage people across whole populations in real time in the way that you can't with abstract things, like how do we create an attitude for employment, identity. Yeah? More stories like this, fewer stories like that, it allows them to engage a lot more people. So one of the things we just launched in collaboration with Bank University, based on work we've done with the Welsh Audit Office before, and I think it's Cardiff School of Journalism shortly as well, is what we're calling the Small Countries Project. Because I got fed up being a Welshman doing work for other countries around the world and never doing it for my own. So that was part of the motivation, but also a firm belief that small countries can change the way the world works, whereas large countries can't. They're too bureaucratic. If you small countries, once you get to know people, things can happen quite quickly. But this program is starting in Wales. It's also going to run in New Zealand, Nova Scotia. We're interested in the Basque Country. Partly it's actually because I'm doing the Camino next year or the year afterwards. So I'm really glad to hear there's going to be good food again. That's very encouraging. But the concept is small countries are well enough connected and have enough cultural cohesion that actually they can move much faster. So one thing we're doing there is, and I'll give you an example, 2 or 3 projects which will run over the next 3 to 4 months. And these are available across the whole of Wales as part of that program, to be clear. One we're going to start in Rhondda, also in Gwynedd, is kids from schools going into their communities. Yeah? Ideally, we want to get this to the point where it happens weekly or monthly, to gather stories from those communities, from their grandparents, their parents, and their own generation about what's working or not working in those communities. Now, with distributed ethnography on apps, yeah, and we don't actually have Likert scales or any of that sort of stuff, we have deliberate ambiguity. You actually, therefore, can get feedback in real time. And the goal on that is actually to save a fortune in market research. Because the money people spend to find out things by sending out researchers and then 2 or 3 months of interpretation. Whereas actually, if you use your own kids as part of an oral history project, which is part of the baccalaureate anyway, you've got a feedback mechanism which is real. You've also got the ability for AMs or counsellors to go and deal with small problems early, rather than talk about big projects to deal with big problems downstream. The other thing with the Gwynedd on this the other day was actually identifying where you do cuts. Because the trouble is, at the moment, everybody manages to the centre of a normal distribution, whereas the opportunity and threat comes from clusters in the tails of distribution. So there are communities who, with less money than we're currently spending, delivered in a different way, could do more for themselves. But because everything has to be an average solution, we actually don't allow that to happen. So part of what we're doing with that program, and say Rhondda Gwynedd would be the first cases that can expand very quickly, is to actually identify small cluster patterns of coherence, where small investment can magnify very quickly, as a way of actually moving away from the sort of savage across-the-board average-based pattern. At the same time, we're starting to work on patient journeys. personal story about this and finish off on that. So we've done work on this already in hospitals in New York, where you actually get patients to tell stories continuously throughout their hospital visit. And by story, by the way, I mean oral, verbal, picture, draw a painting, whatever. Including representing their pain as a picture. So rather than have that stupid smiley face thing or a questionnaire at the end, where you answer it based on whether you've been cured or not, we can actually measure statistically how people feel at every stage throughout their journey. And that's actually very useful because it allows you to focus on different areas. But it also, in work we're doing on safety at the moment in the NHS, it actually creates an early alert trigger to senior management when things are going wrong, where the cost of intervention is less. You can't have a linear approach to market research to achieve that. Very, very difficult. But then what we found out of it, we actually ended up a training database for doctors and nurses. Nurses could spot depression clusters early, which in a cancer hospital is key. But then the fascinating thing, 50% of the unprompted stories were about breaches of hospital hygiene by medical staff. Because the patient spotted something, so we saved a fortune in audit because the patients could become a sensor system within the thing itself. Right? So that's an example. Now, the other big one on this, which we're looking at, is obesity management, which is a major problem in South Wales. And I'll tell a personal story here. 18 months ago, I was walking around Auschwitz, and I got an email from my doctor. I should say I was feeling really guilty, all right, because I was walking around Auschwitz between Valkyrie and Siegfried, the theatre house in Berlin. Sorry, I'm Welsh, so rugby and opera are part of my life. Right? Well, so you're feeling guilty, all right? And I got an email which said you've got type 2 diabetes. Now, that was really lucky, because if you're in Auschwitz, it pales into insignificance. Yeah? And I also had 10 days to actually do the research and discover that you can reverse it, something you're not told. Yeah? Newcastle studying elsewhere, if you actually put yourself under a starvation regime, the pancreas regenerates, you've got 4 to 5 years to do it, so I went away and did that. I lost 35 kilos in that time and so on. But the point is, that was a journey of multiple small narrative reinforcements from many different people. It wasn't going on how to be a better diabetic course. It's actually rather going to Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm David, I'm a diabetic, it's my fault. Right? Yeah, it doesn't work like that. But then you come to the Arms Park and you realise you can't eat properly. Yeah? If you actually got type 2 diabetes, there's nothing in the Arms Park you can eat or drink. But the players are eating healthily. And despite emails I've sent, nobody has thought about creating a store with this is what Sam Walker did. Because actually the players eat far more healthy now than they ever did before, but we're not communicating. So we're also now looking to get volunteers, and we've already done this in Ohio, to actually keep that continuous narrative of their journey through health. Because we need to think now about well-being, not about palliative care. That's the other problem. Yeah, far too many certainly diabetes nurses they have a palliative focus rather than the well-being focus. It's gradual migration. And that also allows us to do a key thing called acceptation. And with this come out, I'm going to finish, right? Innovation is not a linear process. Creativity is not a cause of innovation, it's a symptom of innovation. Yeah? Running 3 conclusive creativity programs does no material harm, but it doesn't make any difference whatsoever in terms of human innovation. Human beings are deeply pattern entrained. Until you disrupt their patterns so the old patterns won't work, until they're very, very uncomfortable and there's no alternative, they won't change. Right? So making people comfortable, and I think the Nesta guy got this absolutely right, saying whether you're successful by whether people are happy or not is exactly the wrong measure. You're successful in innovation if people are bloody uncomfortable. So one of the key things, and this comes from biology, is called acceptation. So a dinosaur's feathers adapted over time for warmth or sexual display. Then one day, a dinosaur with a lot of feathers falls off a tree. And it glides. So feathers, then, it's exap to flight. So something which evolved for one thing, then leaps sideways. And it couldn't have happened in a linear way, because if dinosaurs kept throwing themselves off trees, they'd die, so they couldn't breed, so you wouldn't get the gene. And this is, basic 101 logic, if you think of it. Cerebellum on the human brain evolved to manipulate muscles, so you could pick seeds out of seed pods. It exacted to control grammar in human language. Human language couldn't evolve in a linear way, it required a sideways leap. In 1947, a Raytheon engineer maintaining the magneto of a radar machine notices that a chocolate bar melts in their pocket. We get microwave ovens. So the other thing we can do, and this is how you scale success, once we got the micro-narratives of people's day-to-day lives, we can also create parallel databases of cures, therapies, diets, etc. And because we get that human metadata level, the thing we developed, right, we can mash the databases together. You've got constant small associations of things which you wouldn't normally associate. So you can innovate at a city level, at a country level, or at a personal level. We call it managed serendipity. You're managing a situation to allow for serendipity to happen. We're doing that in the FARC process. So working with Coventry Cathedral, we're about to create a database of peace and reconciliation things which have worked all over the world that anybody can contribute to, which will be a public good database. But then we're going to associate it with the day-to-day narratives of the peace negotiations so that we get associated ideas happening in real time. At the same time, we're building a sensor network of kids across the whole of Colombia, so we know exactly what the narrative pattern is, so we can put interventions in which will create sustainable narratives, rather than interventions based on what we think would be the right thing to do. So the kind of like the basic point on this, it goes back to Mary Gell-Mann, a famous physicist. The only valid model of a human system is the system itself. Okay? So engagement is not about workshops and surveys and expert reports. Engagement is about continuous real-time feedback loops across the whole of the population, and of doing small experimental things in the present to see what is sustainable and resilient in the future. And the one thing we know is it won't be what we think it will be now, which is why we have to define directions, not goals.